When Jesus comes calling, how do you know it's him and not a telemarketer? Good morning, All Souls Community Church. It's Tuesday, October the 13th. And on Sunday, Pastor Charlie talked all about Jesus calls us by name. When God steps into our lives, he is the one who knows our names. It means he intimately is aware of who we are, and he calls us by name. But the question is, when he comes calling, and not literally on a phone, how do we know it's him? Well, Jesus himself tells us in John chapter 10 that his sheep, his followers, know his voice. So that's number one. And they follow him, number two. They know his voice and they follow him. So knowing his voice, what does that mean? It means that when Jesus speaks, something happens on the inside of us. It's different than when we speak to one another, but there's overlap. Right? Like when you're a little kid and you hear your mom or your dad, you recognize their voice and right away your heart is for them. And so they can speak to you in a way that resonates with your soul, right? When you get a little older and your siblings, you can recognize their voices, right? But when you fall in love and you have a beloved, when that beloved speaks to you, and especially when they speak your name, and maybe in particular on a particular day when they're giving their life to you and they speak your name, it resonates deep inside of you, doesn't it? Where all of a sudden it's like their voice saying your name and it's right? And there's an angle to that I think is worth bringing out, because it's not just that they've spoken your name, but you've actually been given a new name. Especially brides in our culture, what do brides typically do is they take the name of their bridegroom. Well, that's exactly what God says in the scriptures happens to us. That when Jesus comes to us, he comes to us as a bridegroom, and we are the bride as the church. And the church is given a new name that he and we alone know. So that when Jesus speaks to us, he's literally saying this: I'm speaking to you in a way that knows who you are and were, but also I'm speaking to you with the name that declares who you will be. The name that actually, Isaiah 62 talks about it like this. He says, you were once called desolate, but now you're going to be called beloved. You were once called alone, right? And abandoned, but now you're going to be called, my delight is in her. Do you hear it? It's not just that he knows our name, he knows our new name. He gives us a new identity because your name was your identity. That's why when God was asked, hey, what's your name? He said, Yahweh, I am that I am. There's no beginning, there's no end to me, right? And Jesus, his name, Yeshua, means the Lord who saves, Yahweh who saves. So it's not just some random like, oh, how about Joe, right? Like it's your name is who you are. And so when he talks about our name, that he calls us by name, there's a reason why when God calls his people out of the land of the Chaldees, and he's going to create like an entire nation through Abraham and Isaac and then Jacob. When it's through Jacob, he renames Jacob what again? Do you remember? Israel, which stands for wrestles with God, because Jacob literally wrestled with God, but then for all time, God's people were going to do that very thing. We were going to wrestle with him because we constantly think we know better, and God is constantly allowing us to wrestle so that there we can see there's grace, even as he allows us to hit him. For by his stripes, the ones that I gave him, I would be healed. There's beauty in the reality that God calls us by name, not just the name that used to describe us. Loser, failure, not enough, egomaniac, workaholic, whatever it is for you. But the name that now describes us when God weds himself to us, beloved, my delight is in you, chosen, forgiven, cleansed, new, mine. The reason why it matters that we talk about this whole idea of being called by name, and the reason why we looked at it in Ezra chapter 2 is because of the simple reality that when God calls us, he doesn't call us in general. He calls us from something to something. So that's why when Jesus says, my sheep know my voice, but they also follow me, they listen to me, that's what he's talking about. My sheep are the ones who not just hear me and therefore have this feeling on the inside, but they're also ones who follow me. who follow me even through the valley of the shadow of death. Even when it feels like they're going to die, when they're surrounded by enemies, even when he makes a table before us in the presence of our enemies, we're going to follow him. Why? Why? Because there's one who knows us down deep, all the way down to the dregs, who knows us to the bottom. There's one who knows us like that, but who's also wed himself to us, who loves us like that, so that no matter what we're walking through, we can trust him. No matter what we see around us, we know he's going to be faithful to us. There's a way that the Bible describes this reality of God's faithfulness to us. He says this: it's not just that he calls us by name, but that he says he also writes our name in the book of life. That our names are in the book. That God, he so weds himself to us that it's like before everyone and all time, here's the book. I'm writing your name in. Is your name in the book? Do you know? Do you know if your name's there? Here's how he says you know. When he speaks, are we listening? Is there something that has changed inside of us because we've heard God? And God, sometimes he speaks to us audibly. Sometimes he speaks to us through nature, right? But most often he speaks to us through his word and through his people. And so maybe for you, even right now, God's speaking and saying, hey, I've been coming after you. I've been calling. I've been knocking. I've been seeking. And now today is the day. And maybe it's not for the first time that you're giving your heart to him, but he's calling you perhaps to recenter and to refocus and to realize you've lost sight of who you are. You've forgotten that you're not that old person, the old man, the old woman that the Apostle Paul talks about that used to live inside of here, but that because God has called us, Jesus has called us by name and called us a new name to live into this new name, that we are now free from that old way, free to live a new way that's not ruled by fear, that's not trying to control the world so that it feels safer for me, that's not willing to sacrifice you on the altar of me, but that is instead actually following Jesus in the way that Jesus lived. There's a picture of that in Philippians chapter 4, with reference to this book of life notion, where Paul is writing to this church and he says there's two women there, Euodia and Syntyche, and he says, I'm pleading for them to agree with one another. Why? Because both of their names are written in the book of life. Let me translate that for just a second. He says this is the way you follow the shepherd. If your name is written in the book, if you're part of the family, if he has wed himself to you, here's one very concrete way that he wants us to live that out: to agree. Doesn't mean that we have to agree on everything in life. He's saying, I want you to agree in the Lord. In other words, whatever you're disagreeing about right now takes second place to your agreement in Jesus. That you are united first and foremost as family, and family doesn't change. We live as family, and everything else you're disagreeing with comes second. Beloved, I plead with you today, as those whose names are written in the book of life, those to whom Jesus has wed himself and given you a new name that's far better than the old name you once had. Will you let today be a day? Will you let your disagreements with one another be second place to this agreement in the Lord? That we belong to him, that we're going to follow him no matter what, and that in the end, we are going to spend eternity together, feasting at the table of our beloved together. Today, this Tuesday, we get to go and agree. I'm praying that you will. God be with you today.